Is the Sony ZV-E1 a pro camera? Yes, but also no. And yes, before you're wondering, in this video, I do have overheating tests, dummy battery, 4K 60, those kinds of things. Expect that a little bit later in the video. Camera, if you're providing services for someone, has to have certain sets of features, reliability. So we've got to go a bit deeper into what makes this potentially a pro camera, but also kind of restricts it from being a pro camera. It shoots 4K 60 with no crop, which is very important to me. It means I can use a 16mm exactly as a 16mm. I can shoot in 4K 60 and slow it down in post. I typically shoot most real estate in 4K 60, 10-bit 422. So if you mess up your white balance or you really need to push the colors in one direction or the other, you have the ability to do so. You got Sony's autofocus, which is impeccable. You can rely upon, and you really should in a pro environment these days. And also you have a fully customizable camera. You can change how the camera behaves, performs, have your own set of custom settings for different environments. You can change it to work however you want. You've got the same low light performance as the FX3 and A7S III, which as someone who shoots weddings comes in extremely handy. That in itself is pretty ridiculous. I often shoot a lot of the day at a second base ISO, just to control the light coming in there with an ND filter. That is a lifesaver. Now it might be different for you, but those are what I call pro features, and they're all in the ZV-E1. I would not buy a camera these days if it did not have those features in it. And at the cost that Sony is charging for this, some people will say, oh, well, that's quite expensive. It's actually very reasonable, depending on the way you look at it. But there's still some things that make this a lot less of a pro camera. Yes, the overheating issues is in that, and we're getting to it. But firstly, the low res screen. It's lower quality, it's not as bright. That does potentially have issues when you are on a very, very sunny environment. It's vastly different from the experience on the FX3, on the A7R5, which has like the best screen of all the Sony cameras so far. Even setting this to sunny weather, still not going to do it. Also, the tiny little HDMI port. That's not a pro port by any means. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you don't want to have to use those anymore. That is a very small port, which means it can become very loose very easily, potentially come disconnected from the board. It's a very common issue we used to have with Sony cameras a while back, and seeing that on there makes me think of all the issues we used to have. I wouldn't trust that if you're outputting to an external monitor for an extended period of time. Don't like that port. We're past it now. Don't want to see it on any cameras anymore. I wouldn't trust it. Tack on from the screen earlier, there's no EVF. If you have the A7S III, that has an EVF on there. If not the best EVF that Sony has, it's like 9 million dots or something like that. So if the screen's not cutting it for you, you can look through the EVF and you're good to go. You know how to properly expose your shot. You know how things are going to look, even in a very, very bright environment. FX3 doesn't have the EVF, but it has a much better HDMI port. It's a full-size HDMI port. So you can plug in an HDMI cable and output to a monitor. You can use a monitor that has a much higher nit count, and it's much easier to see in bright environments. This doesn't have an EVF. This has the smaller HDMI port. It's not good for bright, sunny environments. Now you could mitigate that by having a loop on here. You could get a little screen shade if you wanted to. I'm sure people are going to come out with those. But just know that is a potential issue with this camera that makes it a lot less pro, in my opinion. Now, although I like that the SD card port has been moved to this side, so when it's attached to a gimbal, you can quickly get it out without having to remove it from the gimbal, there's only one card slot. Now, one card slot, some will say is enough, because they've never had an issue with an SD card. As soon as you've had an issue with an SD card once, you will want a camera that has 2 SD card slots. Everything I shoot, even right now, simultaneously records to slot 1 and to slot 2, both photo and video. So if I have an issue with either card, doesn't matter, I have a backup. I shot a video with Gerald at NAB where we were using this camera on me and another camera on him at the same time simultaneously, and the take went over an hour, and the whole time I was worried until I literally hit record to close the file off and I saw we were good to go, because if something happens with an SD card, even until it's like backed up on a computer, there's only one copy of it. So that is a bit of a lesser pro feature and more of a reliability worry, something you have to always be thinking about. And then the body design. It is a tiny little body, which is a great thing if you're a vlogger, if you're a content creator, you want the smallest possible vlog setup that's out there. I think this is going to be it. But when you have a smaller body, it means more thermal problems. Thermal problems are essentially ways that the camera has to dissipate its heat. There's not a lot of way for this to dissipate heat, which means there are going to be issues with overheating. Now, the easiest way to get around the heat issues that you could potentially have with the ZV-E1 is to immediately turn it to the high heat setting. If you start getting heat issues straight away, that's probably why. Change it to that. Shooting in 24 frames a second, I haven't had any issues with this. Even with that super long take with Gerald, no heat issues whatsoever. 60 frames per second did give me some issues with the screen closed. And as soon as you open it up, you can get a little bit longer than that. Let's actually jump in and take a look at all the overheating tests that I performed and what the results were.
First test here with all the settings on the screen. The important factor here is I'm using a dummy battery over USB-C and the screen is closed. The overheating symbol came on at 12 minutes and 34 seconds. Then we got a little bit more time before a full camera shutdown at 13 minutes and 41 seconds. Second test was exactly the same as the first one, just letting the camera sit for a minute after the first test full shutdown. So the overheating symbol came on at 2 minutes and 32 seconds. And then again, full camera shutdown, this time at 3 minutes, 25 seconds. The third test is exactly the same as the first two, just with letting the camera completely cool first. This time, with the screen open. With the A7 IV, this made a huge difference. The overheating symbol comes on at 23 minutes 32 seconds, so already a big improvement there just with having the screen open. And then a full camera shutdown at 25 minutes and 30 seconds. So fourth test, same as the previous ones, screen open, but an official Sony battery, no dummy battery this time around. Spoiler alert, this is the best performance I managed to get for 4K 60. So this was something I'd never seen before. The overheating symbol comes on there at 4 minutes 54 seconds, and then it goes away again. It's like, actually, no, we're good. We're just gonna carry on. Oh, no, actually, there we are. Now, I actually underestimated how much battery I had left on the FX3, which I was recording with, so we had to swap to the recorded video file on the ZV-E1 instead. You can tell it's still recording because the clock rolls over 1 minute on the iPad. And the file continued to run until 46 minutes and 48 seconds when we had a full camera shutdown. So to draw some conclusions from those tests,
best thing you can do is to use an internal battery, Sony battery, and make sure the screen is out. I feel like we're mimicking the results from the A7 IV here when shooting in 4K 60, but needless to say, that's the best way to get around any potential overheating issues you might have with this camera. So is this a pro camera? Yes, it is, like I said at the start, but also no, it isn't. Now make no mistake, you can use this to shoot pro video. I use this to shoot a real estate video for my wife, which I would typically charge a decent amount of change for, but it's my wife, so it's not really something I can charge her for. Needless to say, it worked flawlessly, exactly the same as my FX3 would, as my A7S III would have before I sold it. Zero issues. It's good and it's bad. You can't compare this to the FX3 or the A7S III, even though it has the same internals, the same guts. It's a different category of camera that's much more attainable for people if you are looking at getting one of those cameras. This camera makes me think back to my first Sony camera, which was a Sony a6300. Now at the time, that was really the only Sony camera that I could afford. I knew I needed to go Sony. I knew there was better options out there, but that was the only one I could afford that had the feature set that I wanted at the time. So I think that's exactly what this camera is designed for. It's for people that want to get certain features, but can't necessarily afford those higher end cameras right now, but allow you to get your feet wet, maybe make some money in the meantime until you get your feet on the ladder a little bit, have a little bit more money, start taking it a bit more seriously, and then want to get into the FX3 and A7S III. This is in its own category. This is a fantastic camera for someone just getting started. Think about that and everything I said in this video before you jump in to purchase one of these. And if you're looking at an FX3, you have the budget for an FX3, get an FX3, don't get this. Hopefully that helps you out. That's all I've got for you in this one. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.